Good evening. That was really quiet. We can do better, right? Okay, ready? Good evening. Good evening. Oh, that's excellent. That will make our guest really happy to hear. This year, as you know, we are celebrating 100 years of women at William & Mary. And to commemorate this year, the university is hosting numerous leaders to come here and share their experiences, introduce new ideas, and talk about the future with us. A celebration at this scale for the whole year, designed to have meaningful impact in our community, requires creativity, thoughtfulness, and a great deal of dedicated planning. Not to mention a team of people to make every room like this that we're in together work, to raise the lights, to bring the lights down, to give us the audio. So there are many thanks to be said. I'm going to start in 2016 when President Emeritus Taylor Reevely and Provost Michael Halloran first brought together a 22-person advisory committee. Since then, so many volunteers have joined in leading this centennial celebration. And it's, I think, important to thank a couple of key leaders, as well as, wonderfully, our facilitator for tonight. Let me start by thanking Jane Barnard, James Cutler Professor of Law Emerita, and Senior Director of Alumni Engagement and Inclusion Initiatives, Valerie Cushman. Where are you guys here? Oh, there you are. Okay, thank you. Jane and Val are co-chairs of the committee celebrating the 100th anniversary of coeducation at William & Mary, and we have them and all of the folks that they have worked with to thank for an amazing year. I also want to thank Claire McKinney, Assistant Professor of Government, who will moderate the Q&A portion of tonight's event, which is going to be really exciting. Tonight's Andrews Fellowship speaker advocates for change, uncovering truths in workplaces and in culture. And as we think together about the future of work at William & Mary this year, it's especially fitting to have somebody who's had such an impact on how we think about workplaces now and going forward. Jodi Kantor is a prize-winning investigative journalist as well as a best-selling author. In October of 2017, Ms. Kantor, along with her colleague Megan Twohey, broke the story of decades of sexual abuse allegations against Harvey Weinstein. The story helped fuel the #MeToo movement, which was founded by civil rights activist Tarana Burke, who we are excited to have visit campus this spring, by the way, so keep your eyes out for that. Together with a team of colleagues who exposed harassment across industries, many industries, Ms. Kantor and Ms. Twohey were awarded the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service, journalism's highest award. Ms. Kantor's work on the Harvard Business School's efforts to change its culture for women sparked conversations at business schools around the country. And her reporting on working mothers and breastfeeding galvanized two readers to create the first freestanding lactation suites. Ms. Kantor covered the 2008 and 2012 presidential campaigns, and her best-selling book, The Obamas, which is incredibly fascinating to read, was published in 2012. It documented how the two adapted to the jobs of President and First Lady together. So please join me for the great pleasure of welcoming Ms. Jodi Kantor.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I am so honored to be here tonight. I wanted to start by telling you the story of a different kind of fall evening. This is the story of a taxi ride in New York City. Megan Twohey and I were speeding through the dark Manhattan night. I think it was the middle of the night. It was October of 2017, and it was a few nights before we broke the Harvey Weinstein story. We were two very exhausted investigative reporters. We had been at work until midnight for days and days in a row, and that night when we decided we were so tired that we could barely function at our keyboards, we collapsed into a cab together and headed for our apartments a few blocks away from one another in Brooklyn. Now, for months at that point, Megan and I had certainly felt the raw power of what we were about to report about Harvey Weinstein. We had said things to one another like, I think 30 years of our pop culture history now look corrupt based on what we know. All of those Oscar ceremonies that we watched at home, they were even more fake than anyone knew. We think the casting couch has survived longer and been much worse than anyone publicly acknowledges. We would look around New York City as we rode the subway, as we walked to the office, as we moved through Times Square, and we would say to one another, what would happen if all of these people knew what we knew? But that evening on the cusp of publication, in the privacy of our shared taxi, that's not how we talked. Investigative journalists are supposed to apply skepticism to everything, including our own stories, because that's how we make them stronger. And so during that cab ride, we questioned whether anyone would really care what we were about to publish. One of our editors, Matt Purdy, had repeatedly pointed out, look, Harvey Weinstein is not that famous. How many people in this room had heard of Harvey Weinstein before this whole thing broke? Not everybody, I think maybe not even half. We knew that the history on this issue was a history of lack of accountability. For example, Tarana Burke had been working on behalf of victims for years, coining the phrase Me Too, trying to raise awareness about the allegations against the musician R. Kelly, and yet her warnings were not always heeded. Some of our Hollywood sources had told us that even if we were able to publish our story, nothing would change. Whatever Harvey Weinstein did or did not do to women, that was how Hollywood worked. That was how life worked. So by the end of the cab ride, when I dropped Megan off at her apartment, we had completely talked ourselves out of the idea that the article would have much impact at all. I remember Megan saying something like, after all this work we've done, after all the secrets we've discovered, what if nobody cares? What if nobody cares? I am a journalist because I believe people do care. I grew up believing in the power of stories. My grandparents are Holocaust survivors. My grandmother is still going. Last May 8th, we celebrated the 73rd anniversary of her liberation. Last week, she turned 95. I spent my childhood surrounded by people with numbers tattooed on their arms and steeped in questions like, what really happened to that guy over there? How could something like this occur? Of the survivors, who is willing to tell their story? Who is too traumatized to speak? And how can we get these people to trust us and open up? In other words, even though I was far too young to think of it this way, I was steeped in some of the fundamental questions of investigative journalism. Many years later, as I actually practiced journalism, I became particularly excited about the potential for readers to act on our reporting, to take our work and to use it in constructive and inspiring ways. In 2013, I was finishing a long stint, 6 or 7 years, of covering Barack and Michelle Obama. It was a very high-flying beat with a lot of conventional rewards. Reporting at the White House, having access to the president's inner circle. It was the kind of work that got you on Charlie Rose, back when that meant something different. That year, I got an email out of the blue about an old story of mine, one I had written years before, in 2006. The article was about the two-class breastfeeding system. White-collar hourly workers had access to fancy lactation rooms and time off the job to breastfeed or pump, and blue-collar workers and workers who were paid an hourly wage found it almost impossible to pump on the job. In fast food restaurants, women didn't get the break they needed. They had to pump in the restroom if they had a place to pump at all. It was incredibly difficult for them to feed their babies. The story was published to a polite, concerned reception. Little did I know that the woman who was writing me the email, Sasha Mayer, had read the story 7 years before when it was published, and she and a partner had spent all of those 7 intervening years working to fix the problem. They had created this thing called a freestanding lactation station, kind of like a phone booth for breastfeeding or pumping, but nicer. They called it Mamava for Mothers on the Go, and they had a prototype, and they were about to install it in the Burlington, Vermont airport. It was such a slender little effort. It was one piece of equipment. And have you ever been to the Burlington, Vermont airport? It's endearingly small. It feels like you're waiting to take off from your aunt's living room. Compared to the glory and flash of the White House and of presidential biography and television appearances, it was nothing. But it meant something to me. And frankly, it spoke to me in a way that nothing in political coverage ever had. It showed the magic of what readers can do. Years before the Me Too movement, I had that tiny glimpse that the audience, essentially all of you, can take our journalism and do things with it that we never dreamed. It was also one of my first clues that I wanted to write a kind of female-centric journalism in which women's stories and lives would be the primary terrain. At the time, I think gender coverage felt like a kind of backwater to people in the newsroom, like it wasn't ambitious or it could be limiting. But I forged ahead, and what I worked out over the next couple of years was that gender was not only a subject, it was an investigative technique and an advantage. I reported on Harvard Business School and Starbucks and Silicon Valley and Amazon, and I found that by focusing on what the women had experienced, I could see new things about those institutions and the functioning of power. That principle was also true of an extraordinary story that the paper published in April of 2017. It wasn't my story. It was by Emily Steele and Mike Schmidt, my colleagues. It was about Bill O'Reilly's trail of settlements for sexual harassment allegations. Now I know that the O'Reilly story now feels like it was many, many, many harassment stories ago. But this was a seminal story because it established that Fox and O'Reilly had spent many millions of dollars. Emily and Mike eventually documented that he spent $45 million along with Fox to silence women and get them not to talk about their allegations. And not only that, but after the story was published, advertisers, who were really speaking on behalf of you, the audience, revolted. And astonishingly, Bill O'Reilly was fired. Bill O'Reilly, the most powerful host in cable television, a man who had helped influence the national debate for years and years, and he was gone all of a sudden. And what it did is it caused us internally at the Times to ask what now seems like a very quaint question, which is, are there other powerful men in American life who have covered up abusive behavior towards women? The Times made a major commitment to this reporting, and by the way, if there are any New York Times subscribers in the room tonight, you helped pay for that reporting, even though at the time you didn't even know what you were paying for. And what you paid for was for Megan Twohey and I to spend months and months trying to figure out and document the truth about Harvey Weinstein. We knocked on doors, we were sometimes chased away, we searched for documents, we very slowly built trust with sources. We heard so many terrible stories, and we carried the responsibility of knowing that if we failed, if we couldn't publish the story, these secrets might stay with us forever. We met so many extraordinary, brave women. Some of them have names like Ashley Judd and Gwyneth Paltrow and Angelina Jolie. Some of them have names that the public did not know at the time. So many dramatic and consequential and frankly crazy things happened in the course of that investigation, and Megan and I learned so much that we're now working on a book about what really happened in the course of that investigation. We want to document what really happened for history and also to bring as many of you on the journey as possible. So let's go back to that period just before publication, the taxi ride home, and the feeling that we just did not know what was going to happen. That was still the case a few days later on October 5th as we stood around a computer on the 4th floor and prepared to publish the Harvey Weinstein story. You publish things now with a single push of a digital button. At the time, Harvey Weinstein was threatening to ruin us legally and professionally. We were writing under legal threat, major lawsuit. Harvey Weinstein had even hired professional spies, Israeli ex-intelligence agents, to track us and to try to dupe us. Megan and I were not afraid for ourselves. We are investigative reporters. We live to do this. Confronting the powerful is why we get up in the morning. But we were very worried for our sources, for Ashley Judd, who was putting her career on the line to tell the truth, for some of the other women who were waiting to come forward, hoping it would be safe. So what actually happened once we hit the publish button? I don't need to tell you because we've all been living through it together. It hasn't stopped in New York or in Hollywood. It hasn't stopped here. It had a serious impact on last week's midterm elections. It's been ricocheting in offices across the land. It has rewritten some of our personal histories. It hasn't stopped around the globe. Here's some of what I think we've learned in the last year and month. We've learned that harassment and assault are not actually individual experiences, even though they often feel that way. The victims feel so much private shame often at what happened. We had so many women tell us, I blame myself. How come I went to his hotel room? I was naive. I should have anticipated what would happen. The most powerful thing I think that's happened is that we now see that this is collective. It's a shared pattern. Many of us in this room, I think, pride ourselves on knowing what's going on with women in the workplace. It turns out that we did not know the half of it. We know that this problem completely defies partisan boundaries. If you look at the body of work that the Times and other news organizations have done on this topic, part of the power and the impact and the strength of this reporting is that the stories span the political spectrum. The Times went straight from O'Reilly to Weinstein. The Wall Street Journal did illuminating work on Steve Wynn, the casino magnate who was also a top Republican fundraiser. The New Yorker published devastating allegations about Eric Schneiderman, a top New York Democrat. A few days ago, The Atlantic magazine tabulated how many politicians' careers have been halted by misconduct allegations during the current election cycle. I'd like this room to take a guess. Do you think this list included more Republicans or more Democrats? Who thinks more Republicans were on the list? Raise your hands. Who thinks more Democrats were on the list? Interesting, more votes for the Democrats. It was an even split. 12 Republicans, 13 Democrats. We've learned that almost nobody did enough to stop this behavior. Not colleagues, not lawyers, not human resources executives, not friends of the accusers or the accused. The moral horror of the Harvey Weinstein story goes like this. This man piled up 40 years of allegations. Not only did nobody stop him, but more and more people decided to help him along the way. Many people right now are asking, reasonably so, what is going to happen to Harvey Weinstein? Will he be convicted? Will he go to jail? Megan and I are certainly following that question. But to us, the even bigger question is, what does this moment really amount to? What kind of social change is actually happening? When we describe this period to our grandchildren, will we say, well, that was a moment, and then it kind of sputtered out? And maybe our grandchildren will say, oh, it still happens. It happens on my college campus. It happens in my summer job. Or will all of us in this room be able to say, I was there when things changed. I watched it happen. I was there when people started to understand these problems in a new way and work to prevent them. And then will our grandchildren be shocked by what we tell them about this era? Will they say things like, really? Actresses in Hollywood used to have sex with a producer in order to get a part? And waitresses in restaurants were groped every night as they took orders and bussed tables, and they felt that they couldn't do anything about it? Grandma, Grandpa, how did anyone used to think that that was okay? The answer, I think, depends on all of us facing some very tough questions together and coming to consensus at a time when, if you haven't noticed, our society is really not so great at coming to consensus about anything. First of all, which behaviors are we really focusing on? The problems of workplace behavior, when a boss abuses his or her power to take advantage of someone sexually in the workplace. Those are very different dynamics than private interactions, like what did or didn't happen between two high school students in suburban Maryland many years ago. What should the sanctions and punishments be for transgressions? Is every offense a firing offense and expulsion from school? What is a safe and appropriate way to have an office romance in 2018, or in the case of the students in this room, 2020 or 2025? If you determine that someone in your office is a harasser and you fire him, do you just let the next organization hire him unknowingly, or is there a way to warn that organization that this person may be a problem? Should harassers be allowed to pay secret settlements, and should women be allowed to accept them? In one of those Bill O'Reilly cases, he and Fox paid one woman, $32 million to swear never to speak about what happened again. First of all, is that even a plausible promise? If a woman then meets a partner the next week and gets married, she's really not going to tell her new spouse about this very significant event or explain where the $32 million came from. And also what we've learned about these settlements is that they're ultimately enabling. They may feel like the right solution for individual women who want to preserve their privacy, who want financial recompense. But what we see is that both Harvey Weinstein and Bill O'Reilly used these settlements to silence people and to prevent them from warning other people about what happened. So what do we think of these, and should they be allowed to continue? And maybe most importantly, what happens to that fast food worker who is being harassed, that waitress? These are the most vulnerable victims because they really need those paychecks. They literally cannot afford to speak back to these harassers, and they have very little protection. For these women, I'm sorry to say, I don't think anything is really different than it was a year or two ago. But some things are different. I want to mention a very recent development you may have heard about. Only about 2 weeks ago, our colleagues at the Times, the same colleagues with whom we worked on that original group of sexual harassment stories, reported that Google had a major problem in its very top ranks. Talk about one of the world's most significant and influential companies. They found that not only had several high-ranking male executives either exhibited really questionable behavior or they had very serious allegations against them, but that the company not only barely addressed these problems, but they often rewarded the men. The guy who was the founder of the Android phone system, basically, he's called the father of Android phones. After a colleague brought a serious allegation of forced oral sex against him, the company paid him $90 million to leave. So as you may have heard in the news, the result of that story was that Google employees decided to raise their voices. They planned a walkout, which originally seemed like a pretty small effort. We're often very conservative in what we write because we don't want to be wrong, and so when our colleagues were writing about the planned walkout before it happened, they said, we think hundreds of employees are going to walk out of Google offices on such and such date. What ended up happening is that 20,000 Google employees worldwide walked out. Keep in mind that this is a very male-dominated company, so a lot of the walkout participants were men. Keep in mind that these are offices all over the world. And keep in mind that Google has less than 90,000 employees worldwide, which shows you proportionately how many employees walked out. That's the power of what readers can do. And speaking of the power of what readers can do, I want to come back before I close to those little lactation stations, those little Mamava units. They're now spread across the country. There are 400 of them at last count in airports and at stadiums, giving women, especially hourly workers, the chance to feed their babies with privacy and with dignity. So for our part, Megan and I are still investigating, we're still writing. We're very focused on documenting abuses, that's what we do. But we also want to use the tools of journalism, careful listening, fairness, nuance, to create the most productive social discussion we can to move forward on some of the issues I listed here tonight. And as we do that work, there's a mantra that we use that I want to share with you. What Megan and I often say to people who are considering participating in our stories and who are very nervous, they ask us, why should I be a part of this? Why should I take a risk? And what we often say to them is, look, we can't change what happened to you in the past, but what we can help you do is potentially use your experience to help somebody else, to take something painful and put it to constructive use to help the rest of us learn for it. That's our mantra. That's what we're dedicated to doing. That's what we will continue to do. Thank you so much for having me here tonight, and I'm really looking forward to a discussion with Claire and all of you.
So thank you so much, Jodi. I personally have a million questions, but I'm going to limit myself to only a couple so that we can get as much from the audience as possible. But I wanted to begin by, thinking back to a time 13 months ago, which feels like a lifetime ago. So you wrote a blog post in 2015 about these women who started the breastfeeding mobile suites. And you said you were thunderstruck that they had started this. And part of me is, if you were thunderstruck in 2015 that two women took 7 years to make mobile suites, I can't imagine how you would describe the response post the Weinstein story, earth-shattering, universe-shifting. But one of the questions I had, and this came up in your remarks, you say gender coverage was a backwater, or was perceived as a backwater in journalism. And I think that's right, that for a long time we haven't had a sense that gender in the workplace, gender in entertainment were serious and important stories. So what really enabled you to make a career that allowed you to make these questions central in your reporting?
I think a couple of things. I can't say enough about how supportive the Times has been. At every crucial stage, and most crucially with the Weinstein story, when we really needed it, we had the newspaper's backing. And and to work at a place like the Times, you have to be willing to be questioned internally about what stories you want to do and defend your ideas. But I think knowing that I had the power of the Times behind me gave me tremendous confidence. I should also say that I have a really extraordinary editor. Her name is Rebecca Corbett. She's kind of a quiet legend in journalism. One of the many amazing things she's done is that she was an editor many years ago at the Baltimore Sun. And there was a guy who was like a 22-year-old police reporter. He was writing stories. He was on the night desk. He was writing stories that said things like, 3-car collision on Route 85 at 11 p.m., 2 taken to hospital, another 100 words describing the accident. His name was David Simon, and Rebecca said, I really think, you have talent and you can do more. And she taught him, she really taught him to write about cities. And that was, they spent many years working together before he left to make The Wire and Homicide, et cetera, et cetera. So, and then Rebecca edited the story that broke the NSA wiretapping situation, I think in 2006. And so she's been my editor for 12 years. And it feels like we have this running dialogue on, power, gender, American society, culture, technology. We've got a very long-term sense of what stories would be potentially interesting and what also has the potential for real impact. And so it's sort of like my more public partnership is with Megan, which is very, very close, and we work deeply as a team. But it really is kind of like the Harvey Weinstein story was actually broken by 3 women instead of 2, and that Rebecca is the silent senior partner.
What do you think is really important by the fact that this was a story broken by 2 or 3 women?
Not just 2 or 3 women, but I have to tell you, it is important to me to say that Megan and I both have really young children. And the Weinstein story, she started on her first day back from maternity leave. And my youngest child was like a giant relative to her baby because mine was 2. And so the experience of the Weinstein story for the two of us, and I think one of the things that brought us together was this feeling of immense responsibility, because when you have young children, you're so overwhelmed by not just how much you need to do for them, but the existential responsibility of caring for them. Like you've almost got this calculator, going in your head every moment that is tallying whatever their needs are that day. And then the incredible responsibility of kind of holding the Weinstein story in our head and executing it carefully. And, we were terrified of failing. We were terrified that we would be the latest in a long line of journalists to fail to break the story. So that was really defining for us. It was also really hard. People say afterwards, a lot of people said things like, "You did this for your daughters, right?" And we were like, yes, but we also did this in spite of our children, because it was really hard. It was like describing the scene, at midnight of the taxi ride. We knew that the kids were going to be up at 5:36 the next day. But no, I do think that there is a little bit of poetic justice in the fact that two working moms broke the Weinstein story. And also, we were talking about this earlier today, two regular people, right? I mean, part of the reason we were successful is that the things Harvey Weinstein offered people and often used to influence or buy them off, like fancy, Hollywood deals and invitations to splashy parties and a lot of glitz and glamour, those were not things that Megan and I wanted. We only wanted the truth.
So I want to kind of think about that moment in the cab ride a little bit, because part of what's so extraordinary is really what I would say is kind of the alchemy of the story, right? So, you put together investigative journalism, you put together this idea, as you just said, right? Many people had tried to tell this story before or had told other stories, and they just kind of were part of the background noise. And this one became part of a much longer story, the story of folks like Tarana Burke, who had been organizing grassroots for decades to advocate for sexual assault survivors. And then in a moment, Alyssa Milano tweeting, and this whole idea of Me Too becoming not just a hashtag, but the call to a whole kind of movement and transformation. And I think it's very easy to get the journalism lost in that moment. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit about how you've thought about both the moment of uncertainty of, is this ever going to go anywhere, but also, have you seen journalism shift in the way that it talks about issues of sexual coercion or sexual assault since you broke this story?
Sure. So to address a couple of those things, we have puzzled and are still puzzling and are really thinking hard about the question of why this story. There had been lots of coverage of this issue for such a long time, and I don't think there's any one explanation that's satisfying. But of the many, many, many that I think contributed, one of them is that these were extremely well-documented allegations. And remember that we ended up in kind of a race with The New Yorker, which published its own investigation. There was no redundancy between the Times and the New Yorker investigations, maybe only very tiny amount. And yet it was thousands and thousands of words from two publications describing these really upsetting allegations. So I think in combination, those were really powerful. And I think because we had so much documentation, if you go back and you look at our first story, it's filled with company records and private memos and women on the record and witnesses who described what happened. So it's not a story that you finish saying, I wonder if something really went wrong here. It's like example after example after example of this pattern and of this cover-up. And so I think when you're able to document the facts really well, you can create more consensus because everybody can agree on either what happened or what likely happened or something close to that. The obvious contrast is with the Kavanaugh case, because the country could not come to agreement about what really happened in that case. And so it's almost like everybody's emotions or political desires filled that gap. And because people were dealing with essentially different versions of the facts and couldn't come to sort of basic consensus and agreement, it felt like a really painful debate. And it wasn't really clear how much, it was a debate that involved so much anxiety, I think, on sort of all sides, and I'm not sure it came to an entirely satisfying conclusion for anybody on any side. To your question of does journalism report these stories differently, I think it does. I mean, this has become a whole subcategory of journalism unto itself, and even though journalism is competitive, we're thrilled to see that so many other publications have taken up the mantle of this kind of work and done really incredible stories on this topic. The number of them is just absolutely overwhelming. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different cases. And I think it's very inspiring. I'm really proud to see the work that journalists have done. It's also a little overwhelming because all of us are flooded with tips, and cannot possibly do we can't do all of the stories that are out there to do. It's not just that we write about powerful figures, but, journalism is not about sort of like case-by-case processing, right? We're not a social services center that can take on every client. The Times has the entire world to cover. We have to be careful, about what we take on. And so I think the fact that so many tips are coming to journalists is almost evidence that the system is broken in other ways, because people feel like they're not going to get the answers they want from the law, they're not going to get the answers they want necessarily from HR, and they're coming to us. And so it's great that the journalism is working, but other parts of the system need to work as well.
Great. So I wanted to open it up then to the audience for any questions you all have, so I don't monopolize all of Jodi's time. I'll let you make the decisions of who to
Okay,
talk
let's
to.
go to you. I don't have my glasses on, so I have to be a little precise, but I think there's somebody in a blue t-shirt with yellow writing. Yeah, go ahead.
Hello. Hi. So, as a young journalist who wants to go into investigative reporting,
Yes! Yes! Let's give that woman a hand.
I know it can be hard to find entry-level investigative positions. So do you have any tips on kind of working on investigative stories while either in a metro beat or a specific beat, or in a position where you're expected to turn around daily stories?
You're going to be fine. If that's the question you're asking, then you are like so far ahead of the game. What I would do, you're right, there are basically the only kind of entry-level job in investigative journalism is to be a researcher for another journalist, which is a totally fine thing to do, but you could argue that doing your own stories is even better. What I would do is I would do those daily Metro stories, or whatever work you get the chance to do, and learn that craft, because that craft is important. But as you do it, watch out for just what you think the investigative opportunities are, right? I mean, play the story idea game every day when you read the paper or walk around the newsroom. Of everything we learned this week, what bears a deeper look? Why? Who are these characters? Is something fishy going on here? Is something being concealed? Would readers care about this? Why? And you can ask those questions even as you do the work of daily journalism. And I think if you continue to do that, you will have a story idea or a tip so good that you're able to go to editors and say, I think we have to spend a little bit of time investigating this, and you'll be able to. So, great question. Go ahead. Oh, do we go over there? Great.
Hi. So the Me Too movement has obviously had profound positive impacts on our understanding of sexual assault and harassment in the workplace. But in light of recent allegations, such as some of the Kavanaugh accusers admitting to falsifying their accounts, there are individuals who feel as though the movement has gone too far. How would you respond to these claims?
So the first thing that Megan and I always say is that we just want to make a clear distinction between the role we play as journalists and the role that Me Too activists play, because I think those are sometimes confused for one another. Megan and I went into these jobs and we went into these stories to find the truth, right? I heard Carl Bernstein speak last week, and he spoke about the best obtainable version of the truth, and I really liked that phrase. I felt very called by what he said. And so even though we obviously care about these issues and we're thrilled to see the impact of these stories, there's no one outcome that we are pushing for. And activists play a totally different and also, of course, completely necessary role in society. So I feel really careful in answering this question because I don't think it's my role to push or pull back or correct the Me Too movement, right? My job is to report stories that will hopefully inspire these kinds of impassioned reactions and continue to report the truth. That said, I think you can argue. The problem with arguing that the Me Too movement has gone too far is that it also hasn't gone far enough, right? I mean, what about those fast food workers who remain completely unprotected on the job, right? Who are suffering, they may have heightened awareness of the problem, but the solutions are still not in sight. I think the stage we're at now, if we look at this less as like a fight that everybody's having and more as the messy path of social progress and a journey that we're all on together, I think what's happened in the last year is that all of a sudden the floodgates have opened and we have all this new information about what has happened to women and what's really happened to women. And we have new language for describing some of it, right? I mean, things that boys have done to girls forever in high school hallways, bra snapping, smacking a girl on the butt as she passes because somebody thinks it's funny. Those things can now be called harassment or assault, right? So we're thinking through these problems from scratch. We're saying, what do we do about this? How do we even begin to talk about these questions and how to address them? And so one of the things that I'm looking out for is what's the quality of the debate in the public sphere, and is it actually constructive? And as I watched the Kavanaugh debate play out, and by the way, I'm not totally sure what you mean about some of the accusers recanting, because Christine Blasey Ford certainly hasn't recanted.
No, not Christine.
You mean Julie Swetnick, represented by Michael Avenatti, right? So her story does appear to have had problems. I think, as I watched the Kavanaugh debate played out, here were the things I was watching for. Regardless of outcome in terms of whether or not he gets the Supreme Court seat, what is our society learning from this whole incident, and what questions are we resolving? And it was a really unsatisfying conversation in some ways because I don't think we really left that event with things resolved. There's now this giant question on the table of, should a high school era allegation count against somebody in a job interview situation? And this was a really serious allegation, right? This was a potentially criminal allegation. And I think that's a hard question, and it's a question deserving of serious moral and legal and career attention. And it's a question about our lives and youth and personal history and how we grow or don't grow as people, and about accountability. But that like, that's not really the debate we had, right? Instead, we had yet another sort of partisan war in our culture. And so one of the things I'm continuing to look out for is, what is the legacy of that episode and what do we learn from as a society? One thing that Megan and I have seen again and again is that these stories play out in a different way, in a more brutal way in the political sphere than they do in any other sphere. There was a reason I really emphasized tonight a lot of the stories set in the corporate sphere, in Hollywood, in restaurants. I feel like part of the reason the last year created as much progress as it did is that we're better able to listen in a way, right? When we're talking about something that goes on within a corporation, or we're talking about, we're talking about these figures who are not necessarily partisan, like Louis C.K. Or somebody like that. With these allegations in the political sphere, whether it's Clarence Thomas, Bill Clinton, Al Franken, Brett Kavanaugh, what you see is that people often pick sides based on what they want to see happen politically, which is natural, but it adds to the quality of this feeling like a partisan war instead of a collective reckoning of what our social priorities and judgments are. Sorry to make
Rachel, do you want to?
Yeah. Sorry to make you run.
No.
First of all, thank you so much, Jodi, for your work. It's incredible how one voice can help magnify the voices of many and be earth-shaking. So I was wondering, you mentioned that your grandparents were Holocaust survivors who grew up around people who lived through trauma. How do you interview people who have been through such severe trauma? How is that different from your typical interview? And what did you see, I guess, in terms of the mental health ramifications of these people who went through these horrible assaults?
So that's such a great question. I think the first answer is that, in terms of how you interview people, is that it's very rarely sort of like one interview lasting 45 minutes, that begins and ends. It's very much a relationship. I wouldn't talk to a journalist about something that personal without getting to know him or her first. And so it's not a friendship, it's a professional relationship, but ideally you're building trust slowly. You might talk a little bit about what happened at first and then stop and return to it at another meeting. It's really better to meet with these victims in person than it is to interview them over the phone. There's no substitute for face-to-face contact. You are hoping that they'll share their stories and making hopefully the best arguments for coming forward, but you're not really pushing, because pushing can really backfire. To pressure somebody who's been through that kind of experience it can upset the person, and it's probably won't accomplish what you want journalistically. I think that, and also you're trying to really understand the person and what motivates them and what kind of individual journey they've been on, because everybody is very different, and your assumptions about what they'll think and what they'll believe are bound to fail. In terms of the mental health ramifications, it's such an interesting question, because I'm so not a psychologist or a trained social worker or somebody who deals with that. I'm a journalist. And so people will say things to you like, I'm having an anxiety attack, or, I have PTSD. In order to have the conversations you need to have, you do need to take them back to a very dark place. But you just have to go according to people's cues. My goal is never to re-traumatize anybody, obviously. And there's no easy promise, right, of mental health benefits. Like you don't want to be the used car salesman being like, as soon as we talk about this, or as soon as the story appears, you're going to feel much better. That said, I have seen again and again that there is a great unburdening that can come from telling these stories. A self-forgiveness, a recognition that the experience is not individual, a lifting of shame, a better understanding of personal history, solidarity among women, but also compassion. I can't tell you how many women I've seen come forward over the last year who are surrounded by men in their lives who are like, I can't believe that happened to you. I'm so shaken up that somebody did that to you, that I never knew that about you. And that compassion can have a really wonderful effect. So it's delicate. And the thing that makes it most delicate of all is that remember that while it is our job to be a sympathetic ear, it's also a rigorous ear, right? Because you're listening and you're listening for whether somebody tells the same story consistently. You're looking for potential factual gaps in the narrative. People have those gaps. It doesn't mean they're not necessarily telling the truth. But if you're going to bring a woman forward about that, you want to understand everything about her story and also understand the ways in which she might be criticized. And of course, more than anything, you want to make sure that the story you're telling is the best obtainable version of the truth, as Carl Bernstein puts it. And so you're pressing these women with questions like, well, who else did you tell at the time? Because you're going to go ahead and call that person. Why, is there a reason why, blah, blah, blah. And you want to do it in a way that's not shaming. And we try to make it clear that our asking those questions is a form of protection unto itself, right? Because we're trying to anticipate every possible question and criticism. But again, we're not advocates, right? We can be sympathetic ears, but I don't say things to those victims like, I'm on your side, or I'm doing this work for you, or I'm gonna make you feel better. That is not my job.
Another thing is, how do you avoid secondary trauma when you're constantly interviewing people who have been through so much? How do you take care of yourself as a journalist?
Well, thank you for asking that. There's this thing, I think, especially at the Times, but everywhere where journalists are doing hard work, where you can't take, I could never consider myself the traumatized one because I have colleagues who just went to Yemen to photograph and witness those starving children, right? And I wonder if I would ever be capable of something like that as a journalist. And so, or I have colleagues, who have covered wars and seen people die on the battlefield. We have colleagues in California now who are covering those fires as they try to excavate the charred, dead bodies. So my mind immediately goes to all the reporters who are dealing with potentially even more traumatic things than I am. I think Megan has a slightly different answer to your question. She found that Weinstein entered into her dreams in the investigation more. I didn't. I think that I was not that deeply traumatized by the Weinstein investigation because I was very sure of what we were doing, and I knew we were on the right track and that we were finding valuable information and that we were on to something big. I think trauma is likely to occur when you don't know how to process something. And there were scary and anxious moments in the course of our investigation, but I always felt like we were doing the right thing. Thank you for running up there.
Hi, I was just wondering what your opinion is on how we hopefully begin to change our institutions in the wake of the Me Too movement. How do you think that's going to come about? How do you think those changes will happen? Do you think it will be more through like corporations like Google, or do you think it'll be more political, that we'll have to change, the government will have to change its policies, or some combination of the two?
That is such a great question, because what we've been asking for months now is, okay, there's been this shift in social attitudes, right? Things that we used to brush off years ago, we now know are really wrong. But until institutions change, until laws change, until rules change, that social change that occurs doesn't really feel like it's been locked into place, right? It doesn't feel like it's been made permanent, like sort of sealed as part of our social compact. So I think it can happen in all of those ways, and it depends on what kind of environment you're in. I'll give you an example. Federal sexual harassment laws are so weak. When we say that sexual harassment is against the law, we mean that in the most technical sense. Freelancers, not covered under sexual harassment law. Employees of businesses that have 15 workers or less, not covered under federal sexual harassment laws. So there are so many people in this country who, even if they get harassed really badly, can't really bring a lawsuit. So then the question becomes, well, do they have state laws that cover them? And so some states have weaker ones, some states have stronger ones, and some states right now are in the process of passing laws that will fill in some of the holes in these federal laws. So that, I think, is an example of something that can change. Whether or not it will change, I don't know. You know, this question of banning secret settlements is a really controversial one. It may happen in the UK. There are a couple of states here in the United States that have considered it, but it's a huge fight, in part because the plaintiffs' bar, for the most part, opposes it. There are people like Gloria Allred who, do these settlements, who have stood up and defended them and say, I think these are often what's best for the women. So that path is really unclear. I think the Kavanaugh situation was also an example of how institutions don't change. Anita Hill wrote during those proceedings, all of these years later, I'm seeing the same thing play out, and essentially the Senate has no procedure for vetting these kinds of claims. And in addition to the fact that there was no consensus on the facts, there was no consensus on procedure. It felt like the rules were being made up as the senators went along, and so it's hard to have a lot of trust for either side, I think, in that kind of system and process. I think within corporations, there are certainly major questions about whether new rules and procedures will be enacted. The thing that's changed in corporate life is that in some corporations, not all, these kinds of allegations are finally considered a serious business risk, right? That's the big change. It used to be that people could brush them off very easily. Now people think these could actually cause economic harm to the business. But have businesses really built the infrastructure, as you say, to change the system? I don't know. These dilemmas are really hard and nobody solved them. For example, there's a kind of Bermuda Triangle of harassment that we see again and again in these stories, in which a woman will come forward, say to somebody in HR, and say, I have to tell you about this terrible thing that happened because I have to tell somebody. I can't stay completely silent. She'll tell the HR person, and then she'll say, very understandably, but you can't do anything about it. You can't use my name. You can't investigate this. I don't want the perpetrator to know that I told you. I'm afraid of retaliation. I want to keep my job. That is a completely reasonable position from one perspective, but then it ties the HR person's hands. And so we see a lot of HR people who have been called enablers in the last year because they didn't do enough. But in a way, they were respecting the woman's wishes of being sworn to secrecy. So what a lot of people are saying is that essentially the new rule is that HR people and people in positions of power have to say in the moment, I'm sorry, but I can't be sworn to secrecy because I'm a leader in this organization and I have a responsibility once you give me this information to do something about it, which is also a reasonable position but may leave the woman feeling really burned about the way it's been handled. So these are really difficult problems that are going to take a while to sort out, I think.
I think we have time for one more question.
Hello, thank you so much for coming. It's been a real honor. As another aspiring journalist, do you,
Yes, yes.
do you think that this beat of the Me Too movement will continue for new journalists to come into the industry in like a few years' time?
Wait, say it again.
Do you think that in the future, in a few years' time, new journalists can come into this area?
Wait, that journalists will continue to be working in this area?
Yes, and new journalists specifically that can come into this area.
Sure, although, I mean, real talk, truth bomb, I don't know that I'd choose a Me Too story as your first assignment, or in your first year of journalism. These are really, really hard stories to do, and I would recommend a little more protective cover before, or doing it with somebody more experienced before you write a story that could ruin somebody's career or land somebody in jail potentially. But no, I think this story is going to go on for a really long time. I don't think the closet has been anywhere near cleaned out. I think these behaviors continue. And look, also the hope is that this is not just an endless string of person A did something terrible to person B type allegations, but that as we move further into this area and we all grow more sophisticated about it, we can do deeper and more nuanced stories about the social dilemmas that are arising and how things can continue to change. But yes, send me your first Me Too story whenever you do it.
Great. All right, well, please join me in thanking Jodi Kantor for this lovely evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It was really